She was born with the perfume of ash, and the pack learned to call it a curse. The morning Kale arrived at the winter settlement, the snow fell in sheets so thick the world became singular, white, silent, absolute. She stood at the edge of the frozen lake, her breath a ghost between her lips, watching the Alpha King's caravan climb the mountain pass. The banners were black and silver, the colors of the northern throne. Even from this distance she felt it, the weight of his presence, the gravity of his scent carried on the wind. She turned away. Kyle had lived 17 winters in the shadow of mockery. Her scent, faint, almost imperceptible, like smoke dissolving into nothing, had marked her as broken since childhood. An omega was supposed to carry the sweetness of honey, of amber, of desire made manifest. Kale carried the ghost of a forest fire, days after the flames had died. Charred wood, emptiness, forgetting. The pack elders had whispered it during her first heat, their voices stacked like stones. Not viable, not suitable. She will not attract a worthy mate. By 15, no male had ever approached her. By 17, she had accepted the mathematics of rejection. Her bloodline would end with her. She would live as a caretaker of children who belonged to other females, a shadow omega, a woman with a woman's body, but none of a woman's purpose. The settlement she inhabited, Silverpine, was small, perched on the eastern ridge where the pack had exiled the weakest of their kind. Here, omegas who had failed to mate, females who had borne stillborn pups, and males whose scents carried disease lived in stone huts with single fires. No hierarchy, no hope, just survival. Kyle worked in the communal kitchens, her hands perpetually raw from scalding water, her nails blackened from ash. She spoke rarely. She had learned that her voice, like her scent, seemed to dissolve before it reached anyone's ears. But today was different. The Alpha King Revan had come to inspect his territories, a ritual performed every 10 years. The pack had been seized by preparation for weeks. Females had washed their furs obsessively, applied oils to their skin, practiced their gaits. Males had sparred until their bodies ran with blood and submission. Even the exiled settlement of Silverpine had been ordered to present itself with dignity. Kale had not participated in any of it. She had simply continued her work, stirring the great iron cauldron of broth, her movements mechanical, her mind elsewhere. She had heard stories of Revan. Who had not? He was 40 winters old, unmarked by any omega, though hundreds had offered themselves. He had led the northern packs through famine and war. He bore a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the rebellion he had crushed 5 winters ago. The storytellers said his eyes were the color of winter itself, colorless, merciless, eternal. She had no interest in meeting him, and yet, as she stood alone on the frozen lake at dusk, watching the last light drain from the sky like blood from a wound, she felt something shift in the air, a presence, a shadow that was not her own. She did not turn. The scent reached her first, thick, dark, overwhelming. It was iron and storm and something else, something that made her primitive brain scream alpha with such violence that her knees nearly buckled. She steadied herself by closing her eyes. This was the scent she would never inspire. This was the power she could never possess. "You're from Silverpine." His voice was low, measured, the accent of a male who had learned command before he had learned mercy. Kale's heart struck against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned. Revan stood 20 paces distant, alone, wearing furs lined with silver. His scarred face was unreadable, but his eyes, those legendary eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like frostbite. Behind him, the last light of day caught in the strands of his dark hair, making it gleam like obsidian. "Yes," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "Your name?" "Kale." He took a step forward, then another. With each stride, his scent grew denser, more suffocating. It filled her lungs like smoke, like drowning in dark water. She fought the urge to flee. "Why are you alone?" he asked. "Because I prefer it." Something flickered across his scarred face. Perhaps amusement. Perhaps something else. Something she could not name. "You smell of nothing," he said. The words landed like a blade. She had heard them before, countless times, but from his mouth they sounded different, not an insult, an observation, a question. "I know," she replied quietly. He moved closer, and now she could see the gold beneath his winter eyes, threads of amber, of something burning. His breathing changed, deepened. She watched as his jaw tightened, as his nostrils flared. "No," he said softly, "not nothing." He inhaled deeply, and Cale felt something stir in her chest, a recognition, ancient and terrifying. His entire body had gone rigid, as if he was listening to a sound only he could hear. "You smell of ash," he continued, his voice rough now, almost fractured. "Of snow that has fallen on fire, of endings transforming into silence." Kyle's breath caught. No one had ever described her scent like that. Like it meant something. Like it was not a curse, but a language. "I smell," he said, lowering his head slightly, "like I am dying, and you smell like the only thing that could stop it." The words hung between them like a prophecy. From the settlement behind them, a bell tolled 3 times, the call to evening gathering. The spell fractured. Revan stepped back, his expression darkening, as if he had suddenly remembered himself. "Tomorrow you will come to the Great Hall," he commanded. "There is a matter I must investigate." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the snow like a ghost returning to the world of the living. Kyle stood alone on the frozen lake, her heart still hammering, her skin still burning with the phantom heat of his presence. The wind picked up, scattering snow across the ice. Above, the moon rose, massive, pale, watching. She understood in that moment that her exile had just ended, and that something far more dangerous had begun. The great hall of the northern throne was carved from stone so ancient it seemed to remember the world before time. Torches burned with blue flames, a sign of Revan's royal magic, a gift inherited through bloodlines of alphas who had made pacts with forces older than language. The walls stretched up into shadow, and the ceiling disappeared into darkness above, as if the room extended into the sky itself. Kyle had never been inside. She wore the single formal dress Silverpine possessed, a gray linen garment that hung loosely on her frame. The other females had helped her dress, their eyes curious, their whispers sharp as glass. Why does the Alpha King want her? Has she done something? Is she in trouble? She did not answer. The hall was nearly empty when she arrived. Only a few courtiers lingered in distant corners, their attention politely averted. Revan stood by an enormous fireplace, his profile to her, silhouetted against flames that seemed to burn within the stone itself. His scent reached her before she had walked halfway across the room, that dark, suffocating perfume of iron and storm, the scent that made her legs weak. He did not turn as she approached. "Cale of Silverpine," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Tell me about your history." She stopped several paces from him, maintaining the distance required by hierarchy. An Omega did not stand close to an Alpha King without permission. "There is not much to tell," she said carefully. "I was born to the Eastern Pacts. My scent was always weak. I was moved to Silverpine at 13 winters, where I have lived and worked since. Your family?" "My mother died in childbirth. My father rejected me when my scent did not present as viable. He took another mate. I was raised by the communal mothers. She expected judgment. She had spent her life expecting judgment. But when Revan finally turned to face her, his expression was something else entirely, a kind of melancholy recognition, as if she had just described a pain he himself understood. "Come," he said, gesturing to two high-backed chairs positioned before the fireplace. "Sit." She hesitated. An Omega did not sit in the presence of an Alpha King without explicit invitation to do so, but he had commanded it, and so she moved, her body stiff with tension, and lowered herself into the chair he indicated. It was impossibly high, her feet barely touching the ground. Revan settled into the chair beside her, and immediately his scent surrounded her like a cage. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to appear composed. "What do you know of my past?" he asked. Kale considered the question carefully. The stories of Revan were told in every settlement, gossip exchanged between females grinding grain, tales shared between males drinking fermented honey at night fires. "You defeated the Crimson Rebellion 5 winters ago," she said. "The insurgents wanted to fracture the packs. You brought them to heel, but the victory cost you. You bear the scar from that war." He touched his scarred cheek absently. "Yes, but that is not what I'm asking. What do you know of my personal sorrow?" This was dangerous territory. Kale had learned long ago that personal questions from alphas were traps designed to expose weakness. "I know that you have never taken an Omega," she said quietly, "that you have refused every offered mate, that the council grows restless, waiting for you to produce an heir. Do you know why?" His voice was very soft now, almost intimate. She did not know. No one did. But as she looked at him, at the tension in his jaw, at the weariness that lived behind his winter eyes, she understood that this was not a test. This was a confession. "No," she said simply. He rose from his chair and walked to the fireplace, placing his palm against the stone. The flames seemed to respond to his touch, burning brighter, higher, more fierce. 15 winters ago, I was promised to an Omega, he said. His voice carried the weight of a story long buried. Her name was Mara. She was beautiful, all honey and silk and the perfume of summer fruit. The entire pack celebrated the union. I prepared myself to be a good mate, a worthy father to her pups. He paused. His hand tightened against the stone. 2 weeks after the bonding ceremony, I received word that she had been attacked by a rogue male from the Southern Territories, a male driven mad by fever and hunger. She was found 3 days later. The healers could not save her. The child she carried did not survive. Kale's breath stilled in her chest. I killed the rogue male, Revan continued, his voice hollow. I killed him slowly. I made certain he understood what he had taken from me. But it did not matter. Mara was still dead. The child was still dead. And I discovered something about myself in that darkness. I could not bear the thought of loving another Omega only to lose her again. Every time I have been offered a mate since that day, I have refused, because I could not survive that loss a second time. He turned to face Kyle, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart fracture. Not pity, but recognition. A kinship of sorrow. But 5 winters ago, I received a gift from the old priestess of the Moon Temple, he said. She gave me a prophecy. She said, a female will come to you wearing the scent of endings. In her perfume, you will find the beginning of your salvation. She will not come to you as desire, but as destiny. And if you are brave enough to claim her, she will teach you that mercy is the only magic strong enough to resurrect the dead. Kyle's mind raced. She did not believe in prophecies. She had been raised to believe in facts, in the mathematics of rejection, in the cold logic of her own worthlessness. And yet, why are you telling me this? She whispered. Revan moved toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because yesterday, when I stood on that frozen lake and inhaled your scent, every instinct in my body screamed that the priestess had not lied. That you are the ending that precedes my beginning. That the ash and smoke I taste on the wind is the scent of my own soul, returning to life. He stopped directly before her chair, and Kyle had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "But I need to know," he said, "if you are willing to allow me to investigate this possibility. If you are willing to let me understand what it means that a female with your scent exists in my territories, and that my entire body recognizes her as home." Kale's hands trembled in her lap. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings. This was a trap. This was an alpha's hunger mistaken for fate. This was a cruel joke designed to make her fall before she was pushed back into the snow. And yet, as she looked at him, at the scar that cut across his face like a symbol of survival, at the weariness that suggested he too had lived in exile, she felt something shift in her chest. Not belief exactly, but a willingness to step toward the edge and see what lay beyond. "Yes," she breathed, "I will let you investigate." Something in his expression transformed. Relief, hunger, a kind of desperate hope. He extended his hand to her, and after a moment of hesitation, Kale placed her palm against his. The moment their skin touched, the world dissolved. It was not a vision exactly. It was more like a memory that did not belong to her, a rush of sensation and knowing. She saw him as a younger male, standing over a grave marked with stones. She felt his despair, thick and suffocating. She understood, with perfect clarity, the weight of the isolation he had chosen, the way he had built walls so high that no one could reach him. And then the memory shifted. She saw herself, but not as she was now. In the vision, she was crowned with silver, her scent transformed into something incandescent, something that made the world sing. She saw herself standing beside him as an equal, not subservient, but bonded. She saw them as partners in a story that had not yet been written. She gasped and pulled her hand away, but Revan caught it gently and held it against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid, fierce, alive. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "The truth beneath the lie?" "I don't understand," she whispered. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I believe the priestess, and I believe that understanding will come, if you allow it." He released her hand, and Kyle sat back in the chair, shaking. She had been offered no choice, she realized. She had been offered something far more dangerous, hope, and the question of whether she was brave enough to accept it. The chamber assigned to Kyle overlooked the northern mountains, where the peaks vanished into cloud and the world seemed to end in white. A fire burned in the hearth, real flames, not the blue magic of the great hall, but gold and orange and alive with heat. Servants had brought her clothes of fine wool, furs lined with silk, even oil for her hair. The luxury was suffocating. She could not sleep. Instead, she stood at the window and watched the moon rise, full and pale and terrifyingly aware. The lunar cycle had always mattered for Omegas. This time of month, her body should have been singing with readiness. Her scent should have intensified into something undeniable. But her scent remained ash. The moon did not call to her the way it called to other females. A knock came at her door. She turned, heart hammering. Revan stood in the doorway, still dressed in his formal furs, his scarred face shadowed by the firelight. "I cannot sleep either," he said without preamble. "Will you walk with me?" Against every instinct that screamed caution, Kyle nodded. He led her through corridors lined with ancient tapestries, scenes of wars and hunts and transformations from human to wolf and back again. The castle was a living thing, she understood. It remembered. Its stones held the weight of every decision made within them. They emerged onto a high balcony that overlooked a vast courtyard. The snow was blue under the moonlight, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Revan stood at the railing, and Kale positioned herself carefully, still maintaining distance. "The priestess told me something else," he said, his gaze fixed on the mountains. "Something I have not told anyone. She said that the female whose scent would call to me was not born to be an Omega. She was meant to be something else, something older, Something the pack has forgotten how to recognize. What does that mean? Kyle asked. I don't know. But she said it would become clear when our scents mingled, that I would understand my destiny only through the lens of yours. He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something that terrified her. Absolute conviction. He believed in her. He believed in the prophecy. He believed that she was meant to be something other than the broken female she had always assumed herself to be. I want to tell you something about myself, Cale said quietly. Something no one knows. He waited, his attention complete. When I was small, before my scent presented, I used to have dreams. In the dreams, I was standing in a forest on fire. And I was not running from the flames. I was walking through them. They did not burn me. Instead, they moved with me, danced around me. And when I woke, I understood I was not meant to be consumed by fire. I was meant to be fire. She paused, her voice dropping even lower. But then my scent came, and it was ash instead of flame, and everyone told me I was broken. And eventually I began to believe it. I stopped remembering the girl who could walk through fire. Revan moved closer, and now he stood directly beside her, their bodies almost touching but not quite. Cale could feel the heat radiating from him, the dark perfume of his scent. What if the ash is the memory of the fire? He asked softly. What if your scent is not broken? It is transformed. What if you are not meant to burn alone, but to burn alongside someone? She turned to face him, and the breath caught in her throat. His eyes were fully gold now, the amber visible even in the moonlight. This was the look of an alpha in the presence of his mate, his pupils dilated, his body language open and vulnerable. You should not speak to me like this, she whispered. You should not look at me like this. I am not suitable. The entire pack knows. The entire pack is blind, he interrupted, his voice fierce. The entire pack has mistaken weakness for lack of purpose. But I see you, Cale. I see the fire beneath the ash. I see the destiny that has been waiting for you to reclaim it. He reached out and traced his fingers across her cheek, and the sensation was so intense that she nearly cried out. Everywhere his skin touched hers, she felt like she was burning, not with pain, but with recognition. In 3 days, the council will gather to hear my proclamation, he said. I will announce that you are my chosen mate, that I am binding myself to you and asking the pack to recognize you not as an Omega, but as the Queen of the Northern Throne. Cale's heart stopped. They will never accept it. They will say you are mad. They will. Let them speak, Revan said, his voice cutting through her fear like a blade. My choice is not subject to their approval. I have lived too long in service to their expectations. And I believe, I know, that you are the prophecy made flesh. He lowered his hand, but kept his gaze locked on hers. Will you let me love you? He asked. Not as an Omega to an Alpha, but as a broken soul recognizing its counterpart? Will you let me believe in your fire, even when you have forgotten how to believe in it yourself? Kyle felt tears sliding down her cheeks, though she could not remember when she had begun to cry. I am afraid, she admitted. I know, he said softly. So am I. He took her hand and placed it over his heart. She could feel it racing beneath her palm, the heartbeat of a male who had locked his feelings away for 15 winters and was now choosing to open that vault, knowing the cost. But we will be afraid together, he continued, and I believe that fear, when shared between two souls, becomes courage. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her palm. The gesture was so tender, so reverent, that something inside Cale shattered and reformed. She understood in that moment that she had spent 17 winters preparing for this, preparing to be strong enough to accept someone else's strength, to be broken enough to recognize another's fractures. The moon watched from above, patient and eternal, and Kyle, for the first time in her life, stopped running from her own destiny. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and at what exact hour did these northern confessions find you? We wish to know how far the story of two broken souls travels, and at what moments of night it echoes in your heart. The morning of the proclamation arrived cold and clear, the kind of day where the sky seemed to press down on the earth with its own weight. Kyle had spent the night in restless half-sleep, her body vibrating with a tension she could not name. Servants had dressed her in garments of white and silver, the colors of the northern throne, the colors of a mate-to-be. She did not feel like herself. She felt like a ghost wearing her own skin. The council chamber was vast, with a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The gathered males and females of Revan's inner circle stood in semicircles of descending rank. Generals with scarred faces and calculating eyes, priestesses who had survived centuries of transformation, healers who had learned the language of blood and bone. At the center sat the Elder Council, 5 ancient alphas whose power was so concentrated that the air itself seemed to vibrate around them. Revan stood at the apex of the chamber, his body rigid in formal robes of black silk and silver thread. He did not look at Kale as she was escorted to stand beside him, but she could feel his awareness of her, a pressure against her skin like the presence of a coming storm. One of the elder alphas, a female named Sorvan, her hair white as moonlight and her eyes the color of old ice, rose to her feet. "Alpha King Revan," she said, her voice like the cracking of glaciers. "You have called us to witness a proclamation. We are gathered. We wait." The chamber fell silent. All eyes turned toward Revan. He began to speak, his voice steady and ceremonial, the voice of a male accustomed to being obeyed. He recounted the prophecy of the priestess, though he did not name her. He spoke of the call of destiny, of the scent that had awakened something dormant in his blood. He outlined the ancient laws that allowed an alpha king to choose his mate based not on pack approval, but on the recognition of fate itself. It was flawless. It was eloquent. It was also a direct challenge to everything the council believed in. Sorvan's face did not change, but Kale saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the expression of a predator recognizing a threat. "You propose to elevate an Omega from the exile settlement," Sorvan said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "An Omega whose scent is known to be deficient. An Omega with no lineage of power, no proven bloodline, no history of bearing strong pups." "I propose to recognize what the council has been too blind to see," Revan replied, his voice hardening. "That scent alone does not determine worth. That an Omega's value is not measured by her ability to attract mates, but by her capacity for transformation." "And what transformation would that be?" asked another elder alpha, a male named Cross, with a face like weathered stone. "The female has lived in exile for 4 winters. She has done nothing to prove her capability as a queen. She has survived," Revan said simply, "and she has done so without the cruelty that marks many of our kind. That is proof enough." Kyle felt the weight of the room's attention shift toward her. She understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she was being evaluated, not as a mate, but as a potential weakness in the throne. If they could find fault with her, they could force Revan to rescind his proclamation and maintain the hierarchy that had ruled for generations. She felt her knees beginning to tremble, and then something unexpected happened. The scent shifted. It started as a whisper in her nostrils, a sensation like smoke beginning to rise from a fire that had been smoldering under ash for years. Kale's entire body went rigid. She looked down at her hands and gasped. Her skin was glowing, not brightly. It was subtle, like moonlight filtered through cloud, but unmistakable. And from her pores rose a scent that was nothing like the ash everyone had always described. This scent was complex, layered, alive. It carried notes of burning cedar and snow melting in spring, of earth after rain, of something ancient waking from sleep. The chamber fell silent. Sorvin stepped forward, her ancient eyes narrowing. She inhaled deeply, and Kale watched as her expression transformed from skepticism to shock. "What is this?" the elder Alpha whispered. "This," Revan said, his voice carrying a note of triumph, "is what the Pathfinder scent smells like when it is finally allowed to emerge." The whispers that erupted were immediate and frantic. Kyle heard fragments. Pathfinder. Impossible. It has been 10 generations. The old magic. The prophecy was true. A Pathfinder was a legendary designation, spoken of in the oldest stories as a gift that had vanished from their kind centuries ago. A Pathfinder was an Omega born once in a generation. If that, a female whose scent did not call to individual mates, but to entire packs. Her perfume was a beacon, a guide, a doorway to futures that had not yet been written. Kale's entire understanding of herself shattered. Cross rose from his seat, his expression unreadable. "If this is truly a Pathfinder," he said slowly, "then the binding cannot proceed without the consent of all 5 elders. It is law, Alpha King. Even your authority does not supersede it." Revan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then I request the vote." Sorvin voted yes, her ancient eyes still fixed on Kale with a mixture of awe and something else, something that looked almost like grief. Cross voted no, his face darkening with what might have been fear. The 3 remaining elders voted in succession. Yes, no, yes. 3 votes in favor, 2 against. The binding was approved, but Kale could feel the fault lines forming in the room, the way the council had fractured into factions. She understood that Revan had won a battle, but the war was far from over. There were those who welcomed this revelation, and those who saw it as a threat to everything they had built. As the council began to disperse, a priestess approached Kyle, an older female with silver markings tattooed across her shoulders. "Be careful," the priestess whispered. "A Pathfinder's power attracts both salvation and destruction. Some will seek to protect you. Others will seek to kill you, believing that your existence threatens the old hierarchies. You are not safe, girl. Not in any meaningful sense." She pressed something into Kyle's palm, a small vial of liquid that shimmered like mercury under the light. "If you are ever in danger, drink this. It will show you the path to safety." And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. Kyle looked down at the vial in her hand, her skin still glowing faintly in the chamber's torchlight. She realized, with a clarity that was almost suffocating, that her life had just become impossibly complicated. She was no longer the broken Omega that the Pack could dismiss. She was something far more dangerous, a game piece on a board she did not understand, in a war she had not asked to join. The temple stood at the peak of the highest mountain, carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Snow fell in a constant curtain, and the wind carried voices that might have been the ghosts of those who had performed the binding ritual before. Centuries of mates joining, of bloodlines being forged, of futures being written in the space between 2 heartbeats. Kyle had been brought here alone, escorted only by the priestess who had given her the vial. The older female had dressed her in garments woven from spider silk that seemed to catch the faint glow of her skin and amplify it into something luminous. She wore a crown of ice and silver, shaped like crescent moons, and around her neck hung a pendant made of ancient bone, carved with symbols Kale did not recognize. "Do you know what you're about to do?" the priestess asked as they reached the temple's entrance. "I am about to be bound to Revan," Kale replied quietly, "to become his mate and his queen." "No," the priestess said softly. "You are about to become the Pathfinder. The male is merely the circumstance that allows your awakening. The real binding is between you and your own destiny. The Alpha King is simply the first soul to recognize it." They entered the temple, and Kale's breath caught. The interior was vast beyond reason, a cathedral of stone and shadow and something else. Something that felt like the presence of time itself, compressed into space. In the center of the chamber, a circle had been drawn with ash that glowed faintly in the darkness. At its edges stood 5 priestesses, all ancient, all radiating a power that made Kale's newly awakened scent hum with recognition. In the center of the circle stood Revan. He wore robes of white and black, the colors inverted from his usual preference, signifying a willingness to surrender as much as to command. His scarred face was solemn, but when he saw Kale, something in his expression shifted, a hunger, a relief, a kind of desperate hope. The priestess who had escorted Kyle guided her to the opposite side of the circle. The 5 ancient females began to chant, their voices layering over each other in a language older than words. Symbols appeared in the air around the circle, traced by fingers that glowed with power. Symbols of the moon, of blood, of fire and snow and transformation. "Step forward," one of the priestesses commanded, her voice echoing as if it came from the earth itself. Kale and Revan moved toward each other, their steps synchronized by something beyond conscious choice. When they reached the center of the circle, they stood facing each other, a handspan of distance between them, a gap that seemed to contain infinite possibility. The chanting grew louder, faster, more feverish. One of the priestesses came forward, carrying a knife of black obsidian. Without asking permission, she took Kale's left hand and made a precise cut across her palm. Blood welled up, crimson, vivid, alive. The knife was exchanged for Revan's hand, and the same wound was made to his flesh. "Join," the priestess commanded. Revan clasped Kale's bleeding hand with his own, and the moment their blood mingled, the temple exploded with light. It was not a vision exactly. It was more like being unmade and remade simultaneously. Kale felt her consciousness splinter and expand, touching something vast and ancient and ineffably sad. She saw Revan's past, the young male grieving over his mate's grave, the years of isolation, the slow crystallization of his heart into something nearly impenetrable. And he saw hers, the small child walking through fire in her dreams, the rejection, the long winter of exile, the moment she had given up on the possibility of being loved. But beneath those personal histories, she sensed something larger. A pattern that had been woven through all of history, the eternal dance between those who break and those who heal, between the wounded and those called to witness that wounding. She understood, with absolute certainty, that this was not a new story. It was the oldest story, the one told from the beginning of time, the one that would be told until time itself ended. She was the pathfinder, yes, but she was also the healer. She was also the bridge between worlds. She was also the one chosen to teach an entire civilization that mercy was not weakness, but the most radical form of strength. The light faded. Kale found herself on her knees, her hand still clasped with Revan's. Her blood and his blood had mixed until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The cut in her palm had sealed, not healed, but sealed, leaving behind a scar in the shape of a crescent moon. Revan's scar was identical. "The binding is complete," the priestess announced. "What the moon has joined, no power on earth can sunder. They are one and they are many. They are broken and they are whole. They carry within them the possibility of redemption for all our kind." The 5 priestesses bowed in unison, and Kyle realized with shock that they were bowing to her as much as to Revan. She was no longer a supplicant. She was a source of power. She helped Revan to his feet, and he gathered her into his arms. His scent surrounded her completely now, no longer suffocating, but rather like a shelter, like home. She pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, that eternal drum that said, "Alive, alive, alive." "I am afraid," she whispered. "I know," he replied, his lips finding her hair. "But we are afraid together now. That is the promise of the binding. No more exile. No more solitude. Only witness, only presence, only the eternal recognition that we are not alone in our breaking. They stood in the center of the temple while the priestesses began to chant again. A different chant now, one that sounded like celebration and grief mingled together, a song for the ending of one world and the birth of another. The night after the binding, a storm rose from the north that had the look of something sentient, something with purpose. The wind carried a sound like howling, whether from wolves or something else, Kale could not determine. The snow fell horizontally, driven with such violence that visibility extended only a few paces beyond the castle walls. Within the throne room, news arrived that turned the Alpha King's face to stone. A messenger, half frozen and bleeding from multiple wounds, collapsed at Revan's feet. His message, delivered in gasping syllables, was simple. The Crimson Rebellion had risen again in the southern territories. They claimed that Revan had grown weak, that his choice to bind himself to an Omega from the exile settlement was proof that his judgment had failed. They were gathering forces, preparing to march north, intent on overthrowing the throne. "How many?" Revan demanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Hundreds," the messenger gasped. "Maybe thousands. They move fast. 3 days, maybe 4 before they reach the lower passes." Revan turned away, and Kale saw the transformation happen in real time, the gentle male who had bound his blood to hers, retreating behind walls of command and calculation. He was still himself, but he was also something else now, something vast and terrible and ancient. This was the Alpha King who had crushed the rebellion 5 winters ago. This was the male who had earned his title through blood and will and unbreakable resolve. "Prepare the north garrison," he commanded. "Double the watch on all mountain passes. Send word to the eastern settlements. Evacuate the young and the weak to the fortress. We will make our stand here." The courtiers scattered to execute his orders, and Kale found herself alone with Revan in the great hall. She approached him slowly, and when he turned to face her, she saw it, the doubt in his eyes, the terrible knowledge that he had just put his entire kingdom at risk by choosing love over political safety. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "They would not rebel if I had not come, if you had not chosen me." "No," Revan replied, taking her hand. "This rebellion was always coming. It was only a matter of time. The Crimson Brotherhood believes that strength is measured in violence, in the ability to dominate through force. They could never accept a king who chose compassion. My binding to you simply gave them the excuse they needed." "But now, people will die," Kale whispered, "because of me, because of this prophecy." Revan pulled her close, and she heard the tremor in his voice when he spoke. "Yes, and that is the weight you must learn to carry, because you are a pathfinder. Your existence will always be tied to transformation, and transformation always has a cost." He held her for a long moment, and then he released her and turned toward the exit. "Where are you going?" Kyle asked. "To prepare for war," he said simply. "To do what I was made to do, protect my people, defend my throne, crush those who would destroy what we have built." "When will I see you again?" The question sounded small, frightened, the voice of the broken Omega she had been, not the pathfinder she had become. "After we have won," Revan said, and she heard the finality in his words. This was not a promise. This was a statement of intent, a prayer spoken to the gods of war and snow and victory. "After I have proven that a king who chooses love is not weak, but stronger than ever. After I have shown the Crimson Brotherhood that compassion does not mean the surrender of power." He left, and Kale was alone in the great hall, with the sound of the storm howling outside. She understood, in that moment, that the binding had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning. The true test had only just started. She moved to the window and looked out at the snow, which swirled in patterns that seemed almost like words, like a message written by the storm itself. Her hand rested against the cold glass, and she felt something stir within her. Not fear exactly, but something more profound. A sense of purpose, a realization that she had been born not for safety, but for this moment. A female servant approached, her movements cautious. "My queen," she said, using the title that still felt foreign in Kale's ears. "The other females have gathered in the lesser hall. They wish to meet you. They wish to understand what it means that a pathfinder has come to our kingdom." Kyle turned from the window. She understood with sudden clarity that her role in this war would not be fought with blade and blood. It would be fought in the spaces between hearts, in the conversations that would determine whether the kingdom would hold together or splinter apart. She followed the servant, leaving the storm behind, understanding that it would be waiting for her regardless, waiting in the form of doubt, of loss, of all the terrible prices that power demands. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen, because this story will test that belief to its very core. The lesser hall filled with the sounds of crisis and preparation. Females gathered in small clusters, sharing information about evacuations and defenses, about sons and daughters being sent to safety, about the preparations for a war that might last until the snow itself turned red. But when Kyle entered, everything stopped. The conversations fractured. All eyes turned toward her. She stood in the doorway, still wearing the white and silver of the binding, the crescent scar on her palm visible for anyone to see. The crown of ice and bone remained on her head, and her skin still carried the faint luminescence of her pathfinder heritage. An older female, one Kyle recognized as a healer, stepped forward. "My queen," she said, and the other females repeated the title, a wave of acknowledgement that felt like bowing. Kyle moved into the room, and as she did, something shifted. Her scent expanded, filling the space with that complex perfume of burning cedar and melting snow. Several females inhaled deeply, and she saw tears begin to stream down their faces. "I am not your queen, because I chose to be," Kyle began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "I am your queen because the prophecy chose me, because a male whose heart has been broken for 15 winters recognized something in my scent that showed him the possibility of healing. But I understand that my presence here has consequences. There is a war coming. There will be death. And I need to know if you believe I am worth the cost." The older healer stepped closer. "What is your name, child?" "Kyle. I am Marin. I was the healer who attended to the Southern Rebellion's first attack 15 winters ago. I was the one who could not save Mara, Revan's first mate." She paused, her eyes filling with moisture. "I have carried the guilt of that failure every day since. I have watched Revan lock his heart away, believing that love was too dangerous, too fragile to survive in this world. And I have prayed every night that somehow, some way, the goddess would send us a female who could teach him that was a lie." She took Kale's hand and pressed it over her heart. "You are worth the cost," she said fiercely. "You are worth any cost because you give us the possibility of believing that even the deepest wounds can heal." Other females stepped forward then, not all of them, but enough. They shared their stories, of mates lost in previous wars, of children born weak, rejected by their packs, of the shame of not being strong enough, fast enough, worthy enough. And they all had one thing in common. They had lived in the shadow of exile, just as Kale had. They had been told, in countless ways both subtle and brutal, that they were not enough. "If you are the pathfinder," one young female asked, "can you teach us to believe in ourselves?" Kale felt something crystallize within her. She understood, with sudden clarity, what her role in this war would be. Not to fight beside Revan, but to be the beacon that held the kingdom together when fear threatened to shatter it. To be the voice that whispered redemption into the darkness. "No," she said honestly, "I cannot teach you to believe in yourselves, because that belief must come from within you. But I can show you where I found mine. I can tell you that my entire life I was told I was broken, that my scent was too weak, that my bloodline was not viable, that I would never be worthy of love or leadership. And I believed it. I lived in exile because I had accepted the exile as my true nature. She paused, letting her gaze move across the faces of the females gathered before her. But then a male came, she continued, who looked at my broken pieces and saw not worthlessness, but promise. And he loved me not in spite of my breaks, but because of them, because he understood that the ash I carried was the memory of fire, that my apparent weakness was actually the patience of something ancient waiting to awaken. Kyle held up her scarred palm, showing them the crescent mark. "This scar is my mark of binding," she said. "But it is also my mark of choosing. I chose to believe him when he told me I was a pathfinder. I chose to step toward my destiny instead of away from it. And because I made that choice, I am here now, standing before you as a queen. Not because I was always meant to be a queen, but because I was willing to let myself become one." She took a breath. "The war that is coming will be hard. People will die, but they will not die for nothing. They will die for the possibility of a new kind of kingdom, one where an Omega from the exile settlement can become a queen. One where broken things are not discarded, but recognized for the strength it takes to survive being broken. One where compassion is not weakness, but the foundation of true power." As she spoke, her skin began to glow brighter and her scent intensified. The females in the room began to cry, not from sadness, but from something like recognition, like the final unlocking of a door they had thought was sealed forever. They came forward one by one and pressed their foreheads against hers, a gesture of bonding, of mutual recognition. By the time Kyle finished speaking, every female in the room had committed themselves not just to surviving the war, but to fighting for the vision she had articulated. They left in small groups, spreading word through the castle and the settlements beyond. The Pathfinder had come, and she had declared that a new way was possible. That night, alone in the royal chamber, Kale felt the weight of what she had done. She had united the females of the kingdom through a vision, a hope. But she had also made a promise that depended entirely on Revan's ability to win a war. If the Southern Rebellion crushed the Northern forces, if Revan fell, then her vision would die with him. And every female who had gathered in the lesser hall, who had allowed themselves to hope, would face a despair deeper than anything they had known before. She pressed her scarred palm against the window glass, watching the storm continue its eternal assault on the castle. Somewhere out there, Revan was preparing his forces. Somewhere in the darkness, the Crimson Brotherhood was moving north, intent on blood and victory. Kyle closed her eyes and did something she had never done before. She prayed. Not to the gods of war or power, but to something else. To the ancient thing that lived in the spaces between worlds. To the goddess that the priestesses had invoked during the binding ritual. To the possibility of grace existing in a world built on violence. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw something that looked almost like a path forward. The battle came on the fourth dawn, exactly as the messenger had predicted. The Crimson Brotherhood poured through the southern passes like blood through a wound, their numbers vast and their hunger for revenge absolute. Revan led the northern forces from the gates of the castle itself, his scarred face unreadable, his voice commanding as he directed his soldiers with the precision of someone who had learned war the hard way, through loss and grief and the terrible weight of responsibility. Kyle watched from the highest tower, her Pathfinder senses reaching out across the battlefield. She could feel the moment when Revan's forces met the Crimson Brotherhood head-on, could sense the collision of bodies and wills as if it were happening within her own chest. But more than that, she could sense the moment when something shifted. It began with the females in the lesser settlements, They had armed themselves, not with the intent to fight on the front lines, but with something more powerful: voices. They gathered in the castle courtyard and began to sing. The song was ancient, older than words, a melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a song of survival, of endurance, of transformation. And as the song rose, Kale felt her scent begin to expand. It was not a conscious choice. It was instead the inevitable result of the binding, the prophecy, and the 1,000 small decisions she had made to believe in herself. Her pathfinder essence flooded out across the mountains and valleys, carrying with it the vibration of the song, the power of redemption made manifest. The soldiers of the northern forces felt it first, a surge of courage that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with purpose. They were fighting not just for survival anymore, but for the vision the Pathfinder had shown them. They were fighting for the possibility of a new world. On the battlefield, something else was happening. Revan fought as he always fought, with precision and absolute commitment. But as Kale's scent reached him, carried on the wind alongside the female song, he felt something unlock in his chest. He understood, with perfect clarity, what it meant to be loved. Not as a reward for his power, but as recognition of his capacity to change, to grow, to become something more than the armor he had worn for 15 winters. The leader of the Crimson Brotherhood, a scarred male named Torvin, who had been one of Revan's closest allies before the original rebellion, recognized the shift. He knew, with the certainty of a predator sensing a change in the landscape, that the battle had turned against him. He forced his way through the melee toward Revan, his blade already stained with blood, his face contorted with rage. But when they met, Revan did not fight with the crushing force of a male determined to destroy his enemy. Instead, he fought with something more terrifying: mercy. Each blow he landed was designed not to kill, but to disable. Each movement was precise enough to immobilize rather than annihilate, and as he fought, he spoke. "You can still choose," Revan said, his voice cutting through the sounds of battle. "You can still walk away from this. The past does not have to determine the future." "You are weak," Torvin roared, and he pressed his attack with redoubled fury. "A male who chooses love is a male unfit to rule." "No," Revan replied calmly, and in his voice was the certainty of someone who had finally, after 15 winters of exile, found his way home. "A male who chooses love is a male who has finally learned what power truly means." With a movement of devastating grace, Revan disarmed his opponent. Torvin fell to his knees, and the blade of the Alpha King came to rest against his throat. The entire battlefield fell silent, waiting for the judgment. Kyle, watching from the tower, felt the moment of decision crystallize. This was the choice that would define everything that came after. If Revan killed Torvin, the war would be over, but the old cycle would continue. Victory through violence, redemption through destruction, if he chose differently. Revan lowered his blade. "I will not kill you," the Alpha King said. "Instead, I invite you to witness what I have become. I invite you to choose whether that future is worth joining." Torvin stared at him in absolute shock. Around him, the Crimson Brotherhood soldiers, seeing their leader spared despite having been at his mercy, began to lower their weapons. The confusion spread like a contagion through their ranks. How could they justify continuing a war when their enemy refused to grant them the mercy of a worthy death? The battle dissolved not with victory, but with surrender. And in the moment of surrender came something that Kale had not expected: transformation. Those soldiers of the Crimson Brotherhood who were close enough to be touched by Revan's scent, mingled now with the lingering power of Kale's Pathfinder essence, felt something crack open inside them. The walls they had built to justify violence, to armor themselves against compassion, began to crumble. Some of them wept. Others simply knelt. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the war was over. Revan climbed the tower to find Kale waiting for him. His clothes were soaked with blood that was not his own, and exhaustion hung from him like a garment too heavy to remove. But his eyes, those winter eyes that had once seemed so merciless, were bright with something like joy. "We have won," he said simply. "No," Kyle replied, and she pulled him close, her scent rising to meet his, the two fragrances mingling into something new, something that smelled like possibility. "We have been redeemed." They stood on the tower as the sun set, and Kale felt something settle within her that had been restless since her binding. She understood now what the priestess had meant when she said that the true binding was between her and her destiny. She had not become a pathfinder to be glorified or worshipped. She had become a pathfinder to teach her people that the breaks in all of them could become the places where light entered. Below, the northern forces gathered the Crimson Brotherhood not as captives, but as potential. Healers moved among them with bandages and medicine. The females continued their ancient song, now joined by male voices, until the entire castle seemed to vibrate with a harmony that had not existed before. "There will be questions," Revan said. "The council will demand explanations. They will not understand how I chose mercy over victory." "Then we will teach them," Kyle replied. "Together, because that is what pathfinders do. We show the way, even when the way seems impossible." She took his scarred hand and placed it over her heart, and felt his heartbeat synchronize with hers. Two broken souls, finally whole. Two exiles, finally home. The moon rose over the mountains, and it seemed to Kale that it was brighter than it had ever been, as if the goddess herself was blessing what they had created. Not a kingdom built on violence, but a kingdom built on the radical act of choosing mercy in the face of destruction. Not a queen who had climbed through power, but a queen who had learned to rise through grace. As she watched the stars emerge, Kale understood that her story was not ending. It was transforming. The Omega. Everyone had mocked for her weak scent, had become the pathfinder who had taught an entire civilization a new way to be strong. The male who had locked his heart away for 15 winters had learned to love again, had learned that redemption was not something achieved through conquest, but through the courageous act of opening one's wounds to another soul. The binding had been only the beginning. The true transformation was just starting. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe, because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive. Tell us, did you find your own ash and fire moment in this story? Share in the comments where redemption has found you, and how you learn to transform your breaking into your becoming. The Pathfinder awaits your witness.